"I'm pregnant with your husband's child," my daughter-in-law whispered, her voice soft enough that no one else at the table could hear. And for a moment the world didn't shatter the way you might expect. It simply tilted, like a glass set too close to the edge, threatening to fall, but not quite there yet. And I remember noticing the smallest, strangest detail, the way the overhead light reflected off her wine glass, steady and calm, as if nothing had changed at all, as if she hadn't just placed a quiet bomb between us while everyone else laughed and passed around mashed potatoes and roast chicken. Like this was just another Sunday evening in suburban Ohio. Like we hadn't spent years sitting at this same oak table celebrating birthdays, graduations, anniversaries. Like I hadn't spent decades building a life that now suddenly felt like it belonged to someone else entirely. And I kept my hands folded neatly in my lap because I didn't trust them not to tremble, didn't trust my face not to betray me. So I did what I had learned to do over a lifetime of keeping peace in a family that never quite deserved it. I smiled, just slightly, just enough to look polite, and I turned my head as if she had said something mundane, something forgettable, something about the weather or the traffic on Route 9, and she leaned back in her chair like she had just handed me a secret she was proud of, like she expected me to react, to gasp, to confront her right there in front of my son, in front of my husband. In front of the carefully arranged illusion of family we had all been pretending to maintain, but I gave her nothing, not a word, not a flicker, because in that moment something inside me went very still, very quiet, the kind of quiet that comes not from shock, but from recognition, like finally seeing the full picture after years of looking at scattered pieces that never quite made sense on their own. And across the table Robert kept his eyes on his plate, cutting his food into pieces that were too small, too precise, like he was concentrating harder than necessary on something simple, and Daniel was talking about work, about a new client, about expansion plans, his voice easy and confident, completely unaware or perhaps choosing not to be aware of the shift that had just taken place 2 feet away from him. And I listened, nodding when appropriate, responding when spoken to, every movement measured, controlled, as if I were performing a role I had practiced for years. Because the truth is I had suspected something. Not this exactly, not this specific, undeniable statement, but enough to know that the foundation of my marriage had been quietly cracking long before tonight. Enough to know that Lily's presence in this house had always carried a certain kind of energy, something polished and pleasant on the surface but sharp underneath, something that moved carefully through conversations, inserting itself into spaces that didn't belong to it. And I had dismissed it, again and again, because that's what I did, because I believed in giving people the benefit of the doubt, because I believed that family meant trust, and trust meant not questioning every glance, every late night, every unexplained absence. But now, sitting there with her words still echoing in my ears, I realized how much I had chosen not to see, and how clearly everything was starting to come into focus. And she reached for her glass again, her fingers steady, her expression composed, like she had already decided how this story would end, like she had already claimed her place in it. And I wondered, not with panic but with a strange, growing clarity, how long she had been planning this, how long she had believed I would remain exactly who I had always been, quiet, accommodating, predictable. And I let out a slow breath, barely noticeable, as I picked up my fork and continued eating. Because if there was one thing I understood in that moment, it was this. She thought she had just taken control of the situation. She thought she had delivered a truth that would break me. But she had no idea that this wasn't the beginning of my downfall. It was the moment I finally stopped being the person they all thought I was. I did not look at her again for the rest of the evening, not because I was afraid, but because I needed distance to think, to separate the noise of the room from the quiet. Realization forming inside me. And the conversation continued as if nothing had happened. Daniel laughing about a story from work, Lily chiming in with just the right tone of warmth, her hand occasionally brushing against his arm in a way that seemed rehearsed, controlled, and across from me Robert remained unusually silent, his usual easy charm replaced with a kind of careful restraint, like someone trying not to draw attention to themselves in a room where they know they do not belong. And I noticed everything now, the way his shoulders were slightly tense, the way he avoided looking in my direction even when I spoke, the way Lily never once looked uncertain, not even for a second, as if she had already rehearsed this moment in her mind and decided exactly how it would unfold. And I found myself remembering other dinners, other small moments that had once seemed insignificant, like the time Robert said he had a late meeting but came home smelling like a restaurant I had never been to, or the afternoon Lily stopped by unannounced when Daniel was out of town, saying she just wanted to check in on me, her smile too bright, her presence lingering just a little too long in the kitchen while Robert hovered nearby with a kind of awkward attentiveness I had chosen to ignore. And back then I told myself I was imagining things, that I was letting loneliness distort ordinary interactions into something darker. Because after 42 years of marriage, you do not easily allow yourself to believe that the person who shared your life could quietly become someone else, someone capable of stepping outside the boundaries you thought were unbreakable. And yet now, sitting at that same table, I realized that the signs had not been subtle at all. I had simply been unwilling to connect them, unwilling to question the version of reality that felt safe. And I placed my napkin neatly beside my plate when I finished eating, my movements calm and deliberate, as if I had all the time in the world. Because in a way I did. Time was no longer something that belonged to them. It belonged to me now, and Lily stood up first, offering to help clear the table, her voice light, almost cheerful. And I watched her gather the plates with practiced ease, moving through my kitchen like she already owned it, like she had already stepped into a role she believed was hers to claim. And I followed her in a moment later, not to confront her, not yet, but to observe, to understand the full shape of what I was dealing with. And when she turned toward the sink, she glanced at me, just briefly, a flicker of something in her eyes, not guilt, not hesitation, but something closer to anticipation, like she was waiting for me to say something, to react, to give her the satisfaction of knowing her words had landed. But I simply reached for a dish towel and began drying the plates she handed me, the silence between us stretching in a way that felt almost intentional, almost strategic. And after a moment she leaned closer again, her voice low but steady, repeating the truth as if to make sure I had not convinced myself I imagined it. And I kept my focus on the glass in my hands, watching the water slide down its surface, catching the light in small, distorted reflections. And I realized then that this was not just a moment of confession. It was a test. She wanted to see how far she could push, how much control she already had. And I gave her nothing, not because I was weak, but because I understood something she did not. That power is rarely in the first reaction. It is in what comes after, in what is held back, in what is allowed to unfold without interruption. And behind us I could hear Daniel and Robert talking in the living room, their voices low, blending together in a way that felt distant, almost irrelevant. And I thought about the life I had built in this house, the years of routine, the quiet sacrifices, the belief that stability meant safety. And I felt something shift inside me, not anger, not even sadness, but clarity, sharp and precise, cutting through every excuse I had ever made for them, every moment I had chosen to overlook. And when Lily finally stepped away from the sink, she gave me a small smile, polite, composed, as if we had just shared a harmless secret. And she walked out of the kitchen without another word, leaving me alone with the sound of the running water and the steady rhythm of my own breathing. And I set the last glass down carefully on the counter, my hands no longer trembling, my thoughts no longer scattered, because the truth had been placed in front of me now, undeniable and complete. And for the first time in a very long time, I was not reacting to what my family needed from me. I was deciding what I would do next. That night after they left, I did not go to bed right away. Instead, I sat alone in the living room with only the lamp beside the couch turned on, the soft yellow light casting familiar shadows across the walls that suddenly felt unfamiliar, as if the house itself had shifted without asking me. And I listened to the quiet in a way I had not done in years, not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the kind that reveals what has been hidden beneath routine, beneath habit, beneath trust. And I replayed every detail of the evening in my mind, not the words alone, but the pauses between them, the glances that were avoided, the ones that lingered too long, the careful choreography of people who believed they were in control of a story that I was only now beginning to understand. And I could see it clearly now, how Robert had barely touched his food, how his answers had been shorter than usual, how his laughter had come just a second too late, like someone trying to match a rhythm they no longer naturally belonged to. and how Lily had moved through the evening with a quiet confidence that no longer felt like charm, but like certainty. The kind of certainty that comes from believing you have already secured your place. And I leaned back against the couch and closed my eyes for a moment, not to escape, but to organize, to sort through years of memories that now demanded to be re-examined under a different light. And it was not one moment that stood out, not one undeniable event, but a pattern, subtle at first, then increasingly difficult to ignore once you allowed yourself to see it. Like the time Robert insisted on taking over errands he had never cared about before, or the way Lily began stopping by more frequently when Daniel was working late, always with a reason. That sounded thoughtful on the surface, but unnecessary underneath. And I remembered the small changes in my own life, too. The conversations that felt slightly off, the decisions that seemed to happen around me instead of with me. The gradual sense that I was no longer at the center of my own home, but orbiting something I could not quite define. And I realized how carefully everything had been constructed, not rushed, not reckless, but patient, deliberate, as if they had both understood that the most effective way to rewrite a life is not through sudden disruption, but through slow, almost invisible shifts that no one questions until it is too late. And I opened my eyes and looked around the room again, at the photographs on the mantel, at the frames that captured decades of birthdays and holidays and ordinary days that once felt secure, and I stood up and walked over to them, picking up one at random, a picture from 10 years ago, Robert with his arm around me, Daniel standing between us, all of us smiling at something outside the frame. And I studied it longer than I expected to, not because I was searching for proof, but because I was trying to understand when that version of us had quietly disappeared. And I set the frame back down carefully, exactly where it had been, because nothing in this house had physically changed yet. Everything was still in place, still intact, and that was what made it so unsettling. The realization that the structure of my life had been altered, without any visible damage. And I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water, the simple act grounding me in a way I needed, the cold surface of the glass steady in my hand. And I thought about what Lily had said, not just the words but the intention behind them, the decision to tell me directly, quietly, without witnesses, and I understood then that it was not a confession, it was a move, a calculated step designed to shift the balance of power, to place me in a position where I would either react emotionally and lose control or remain silent and appear weak. And I smiled slightly at that thought, not because anything about the situation was amusing, but because she had misunderstood something fundamental about me, something that even I had not fully recognized until now. That silence is not always surrender. Sometimes it is preparation. And I set the glass down on the counter and stood there for a moment longer, letting that clarity settle into something solid, something I could rely on. And for the first time since the evening began, I was not thinking about what they had done. I was thinking about what I would do next, and that shift, quiet as it was, changed everything. I woke up earlier than usual the next morning, not because I had slept well, but because my mind refused to stay quiet any longer, and the house felt different in the pale light of dawn, the kind of stillness that makes every sound sharper, every thought more precise. And I moved through my routine slowly, deliberately, as if each action needed to be considered now, the coffee maker humming softly, the scent filling the kitchen in a way that used to feel comforting but now simply marked the beginning of a day I understood would not be like any other. And I sat at the table with my cup in both hands, letting the warmth settle into my palms, grounding me, and I began to map everything out, not emotionally, not as a wounded wife or a betrayed mother, but as someone who finally understood that what had been taken from her was not just trust, it was position, influence, control. And I realized that if they had been patient in creating this situation, then I would have to be even more patient in responding to it. And I thought about Robert first, not the man he was now, but the man I had known for decades, the one who used to leave notes on the counter before early meetings, the one who insisted on fixing things around the house even when he was not particularly good at it. The one who once told me that stability was the most important thing we could give our son. And I let that memory sit there for a moment before I set it aside, because it was no longer useful. It did not help me understand the present. And I moved on to Lily, to the version of her I had welcomed into this family, polite, attentive, almost eager to please. And I could see now how carefully that version had been constructed, how she had observed everything before stepping fully into the role she wanted, learning where to stand, when to speak, how to present herself in a way that made her presence seem natural, inevitable even, and I had mistaken that for respect, for effort, for sincerity, and I allowed myself a small, quiet acknowledgement of that mistake, not as regret, but as information, something to carry forward, and I stood up and walked to the small desk in the corner of the living room, the one I had used for years to organize bills, documents, the quiet administrative side of a life that no one else seemed to pay attention to, and I opened the drawer slowly, looking at the folders arranged neatly inside, everything labeled, everything in order, and I realized how much of this life had always been in my hands, even if no one else had noticed, even if I had allowed them to believe otherwise, and I pulled out a few documents, not because I needed to read them in that moment, but because I needed to remind myself of something simple and undeniable, that I was not as uninformed, as passive, or as easily displaced as they might have assumed, and I placed the papers on the desk and sat down, the chair familiar beneath me, and I began to think about timing, about sequence, about how to move forward without revealing what I knew, without giving them any indication that their carefully built narrative had already begun to unravel. And I understood that the next few days would be critical, not for confrontation, but for observation, for confirmation, for allowing them to continue exactly as they had been, believing they were still in control, and I felt a sense of calm settle over me that surprised even myself. Not because the situation had become less serious, but because it had become clearer, and clarity has a way of quieting everything else. And I looked out the window at the street, at the ordinary rhythm of a morning beginning, a neighbor walking their dog, a car passing slowly, and I realized how little the outside world had changed, how everything beyond this house continued exactly as it always had, and that thought grounded me further, because it reminded me that this situation, as consuming as it felt, was still something I could navigate, something I could manage, and I reached for my phone and placed it on the desk beside me, not to call anyone, not yet, but as a reminder that I had options, resources, connections that extended beyond the walls of this house, and I sat there for a long moment, letting all of it settle into something steady, something controlled, and when I finally stood up, again I did not feel like the person who had sat at the dinner table the night before, quietly absorbing a truth that was meant to destabilize her. I felt like someone who had been given a piece of information, unexpected and unwelcome, but useful nonetheless, and as I began to move through the house, opening curtains, letting in more light, I understood one thing with complete certainty. They believed they had already changed the course of my life, but they had not yet seen what happens when I decide to change it myself. By mid-morning, I had already decided that the most important thing I could do was nothing that looked like action at all, and that realization shaped every step I took as I moved through the day, because if there was one advantage I still had, it was that they believed I did not know, and I intended to keep it that way for as long as it served me. So when Robert came downstairs adjusting his tie, glancing briefly in my direction before reaching for his coffee, I greeted him the same way I always had, calm, steady, predictable, asking if he wanted toast, if he had any meetings lined up, my voice even, my expression neutral, and he responded in kind, his answer short but polite, the kind of conversation that fills space without revealing anything. And I watched him closely, not openly, not in a way that would make him uncomfortable, but in the small details. The way his hand lingered on his phone a second longer than necessary. The way he checked the screen when he thought I was not looking, and I noticed that he left earlier than usual, offering a vague explanation about needing to get to the office ahead of schedule, and I simply nodded, wishing him a good day, because questioning him now would have been a mistake. It would have shifted the balance too soon, and I needed him to continue exactly as he had been, unaware that anything had changed on my side of the equation. And once the door closed behind him, I did not follow. I did not stand at the window or track his movements. Instead, I returned to the desk where I had left the documents earlier. And this time I opened them with purpose, reviewing account statements, property records, the quiet infrastructure of our shared life. And I traced the patterns with a clarity I had not allowed myself before, noticing which accounts required both signatures, which ones did not, which assets were structured in ways that could be adjusted without immediate attention. And I made mental notes, not rushing, not reacting, but organizing, because this was not about proving anything to them. It was about securing what was mine before they realized I was even paying attention. And as I worked through the paperwork, I thought again about Lily, about the confidence in her voice, the certainty that she had already positioned herself in a way that could not be undone. And I understood that her strategy relied on one assumption above all others, that I would respond emotionally, that I would confront, accuse, create a scene that would allow her to reframe the situation in her favor, and I refused to give her that opportunity. Because emotion, while justified, would only serve them, not me. And by early afternoon, I had gathered enough information to understand the structure of things clearly, enough to see where adjustments could be made quietly, where control could be re-established without drawing attention, and I placed the documents back in their folders, returning them to the drawer exactly as they had been, leaving no trace of the shift that had occurred. And I stood there for a moment, considering my next step. And that was when I realized I needed confirmation, not suspicion, not assumption, but something concrete, something that would anchor everything I already understood. And I reached for my phone again, scrolling through my contacts slowly until I found a name I had not needed to call in years, someone who had handled certain legal matters for us in the past, someone discreet, reliable, and outside the immediate circle of this family dynamic. And I did not call right away. Instead, I saved the number to the top of my recent contacts, a quiet preparation, a step that could be taken when the timing was right. And I set the phone down again, because even that needed to be done carefully, deliberately, without haste. And as the afternoon light shifted through the windows, I moved through the house with the same calm efficiency I always had, straightening things, preparing dinner, maintaining the rhythm of a life that from the outside would appear completely unchanged. And that was the point. The illusion needed to hold, for now, because the longer they believed I was still the same person, the more freedom I had to move without resistance. And when I finally paused in the doorway of the kitchen, looking out into the quiet street once more, I understood that this was no longer about reacting to betrayal. It was about controlling what came next, and control, unlike emotion, required patience, precision, and the willingness to wait until the moment was exactly right. That evening, I kept everything exactly the same, down to the smallest detail, because routine can be the most convincing disguise. And when Robert walked through the door, I greeted him with the same calm tone, asked about his day, listened as he gave a version of it that sounded complete but felt carefully edited, and I nodded at the right moments, responded just enough to keep the conversation moving without drawing attention to anything deeper. And when Daniel called later to say he and Lily might stop by again later in the week, I told him that would be nice, my voice steady, my words simple, because any hesitation now would have been noticed, and I was not ready for that. Not yet. And as I prepared dinner, I allowed myself to move through the kitchen with a kind of quiet awareness, noticing how natural everything still looked, how easily this life continued on the surface even as something fundamental had shifted beneath it. And I realized that this was exactly how it had happened to begin with, not through one dramatic moment, but through a series of small, unnoticed changes that slowly rewrote the structure of everything. And now I was doing the same, only in reverse, only with intention. And after dinner, when Robert settled into his usual chair in the living room, scrolling through his phone, I sat across from him with a book open in my hands, not reading, but observing. The way his attention drifted, the way his expression changed subtly when a message appeared, the almost imperceptible shift in his posture when he typed a response. And I did not need to see the screen to understand what was happening. I only needed to see the pattern, and patterns had become very clear to me now. And I turned a page slowly, letting the silence stretch in a way that felt almost comfortable, almost familiar, because this was how we had lived for a long time without acknowledging it, sharing space without sharing truth. And I wondered briefly if he believed this was sustainable, if he believed that silence could hold something like this indefinitely, or if he simply had not thought that far ahead. And that thought stayed with me longer than I expected, because it told me something important, that while Lily may have been planning, may have been calculating every step, Robert was reacting, following, allowing himself to be carried along by decisions that were not entirely his own. And that difference mattered, because it meant that not everyone in this situation understood the full extent of what had been set in motion. And later that night, when he went upstairs, I remained in the living room a little longer, sitting in the quiet once again, not because I needed time to process, but because I was beginning to understand the rhythm of this new reality, the way each moment could be used, observed, placed into a larger structure that I was slowly building in my mind. And I reached for my phone, and this time I did not hesitate. I scrolled to the contact I had set aside earlier and pressed call, holding the device steadily as it rang. And when the voice on the other end answered, I spoke in the same calm tone I had used all day, explaining that I needed to review some documents, to clarify a few details about accounts and property. Nothing urgent, nothing alarming, just a routine check. And the conversation remained professional, straightforward, an appointment set for later in the week. And when I ended the call, I felt something settle into place. Not relief, not satisfaction, but alignment. As if the first visible step had been taken in a direction that I had already committed to. And I placed the phone down carefully and looked around the room one more time. At the furniture, the photographs, the quiet evidence of a life that had once felt fixed and certain. And I understood that nothing here would remain untouched by what was unfolding. Not because it had to be destroyed, but because it had to be redefined. And I stood up and turned off the lamp, letting the room fall into darkness before heading upstairs, my steps steady, my mind clear. Because whatever they believed they had secured, whatever future they thought was already decided, they were still operating under one critical assumption, that I would remain exactly as I had always been. And that was the one thing that was no longer true. The next morning unfolded with the same quiet precision I had begun to rely on. But beneath that routine, there was now a steady current of intention guiding everything I did. And when I arrived at the office building later that afternoon, the one with the polished marble floors and the muted hum of conversations behind closed doors, I felt completely composed, not like someone stepping into uncertainty, but like someone confirming a decision that had already been made. And the receptionist greeted me with polite familiarity, asking me to have a seat while she notified him I had arrived. And I sat there with my hands folded neatly in my lap, observing the small details around me. The framed certificates on the wall, the quiet efficiency of people moving through the hallway, all of it reinforcing something I had known but not fully appreciated until now. That there were systems in place beyond the emotional chaos of family, systems that operated on clarity, documentation, and fact. And when I was finally called into the office, I was met with the same calm professionalism I remembered, a handshake, a brief exchange of pleasantries, and then a direct shift into the purpose of my visit. And I explained what I needed without hesitation, not in dramatic terms, not in accusations, but in clear, measured statements, that I wanted to review ownership structures, access points, contingencies, and protections. And as we went through each document together, each account, each asset, I could see how everything had been set up over the years, some of it jointly managed, some of it entirely within my control. And I asked questions that were precise, focused, the kind that revealed possibilities without raising unnecessary concern. And the answers came just as clearly, outlining what could be adjusted, what required notice, what could be secured quietly. And I took in every detail without rushing, without reacting outwardly, because this was not about immediate action. It was about understanding the full landscape before making a move. And there was one moment, brief but significant, when he paused and looked at me more carefully, as if recognizing that this was not a routine review, that there was a reason behind my questions. But I did not elaborate. I simply met his gaze and continued, and that was enough, because professionals understand when something does not need to be said out loud. And by the time the meeting concluded, I had everything I needed, not just information, but a framework, a clear path forward that did not rely on confrontation or explanation. And as I walked back out into the afternoon light, the air crisp against my face, I felt a sense of steadiness that had nothing to do with resolution and everything to do with control. And when I returned home, the house was quiet again, just as it had been before. But now that quiet felt different, not uncertain, not hollow, but deliberate, like a space I was choosing to occupy rather than one I was being pushed out of. And I moved through the room slowly, not out of hesitation but awareness, noticing how everything remained exactly where it had always been, how nothing had physically changed, and yet everything had. And I thought about the timing of what would come next, not in terms of days or weeks, but in terms of readiness, of allowing each piece to settle into place before moving forward. And when Robert came home later that evening, I greeted him with the same calm tone, asked about his day, listened as he spoke, and I could see that nothing in his behavior had shifted, not yet, which told me that whatever communication was happening, whatever connection existed between him and Lily, they still believed themselves to be operating without interference. And that was exactly where I needed them to be. And as we sat across from each other at the dinner table once again, the same table where everything had changed just days before, I realized that the dynamic had already begun to shift in ways they could not yet see, not because I had confronted them, not because I had revealed anything, but because I was no longer reacting to their version of events. I was quietly constructing my own, and that difference, invisible as it was, would determine everything that followed. By the time the next family dinner was suggested, I did not hesitate to agree, and that alone told me how much had changed, because a week earlier the idea of sitting at that table again would have filled me with quiet dread, but now it felt like something else entirely, not a test, not a confrontation, but a moment I had already prepared for in ways they could not see. And I chose my outfit carefully that evening, not to impress, not to signal anything obvious, but to remind myself of something simple, that I was still exactly who I had always been, composed, deliberate, present, and when I set the table I did it with the same attention to detail I always had. The plates aligned, the glasses placed just right, the small touches that no one ever commented on, but everyone unconsciously relied upon. And when they arrived I greeted them with the same warmth, the same calm familiarity. And Lily stepped inside with that same quiet confidence, her smile polite, her eyes searching for something just beneath the surface, and I could tell she was watching me, measuring, waiting for some sign that her words had taken root in the way she expected, and I gave her nothing beyond what she had always seen. And we moved through the early part of the evening as if it were entirely ordinary. Conversation flowing easily, Daniel talking about work, Robert adding small remarks, and I listened, engaged just enough, present but not exposed. And every now and then I caught Lily studying me, her expression composed but curious, as if she could not quite understand why nothing had shifted, why the quiet disruption she introduced had not produced the reaction she anticipated, and I allowed that uncertainty to remain, because uncertainty has a way of expanding when it is not addressed, and it creates space that I could use. And as dinner progressed I noticed something else, something subtle but important. The way Robert's attention seemed divided, not just between conversation and distraction, but between expectation and unease, as if he too was waiting for something to happen, something that had not yet arrived. And that told me everything I needed to know, that whatever they had discussed, whatever they believed would follow that initial revelation, it depended on me responding in a way I had not. And without that response, their certainty began to shift, just slightly, just enough to matter. And when we moved into the living room afterward, the familiar rhythm of the evening continuing, I took my usual seat, the one that gave me a clear view of everyone without making it obvious, and I watched the interactions unfold, the small exchanges, the glances, the moments of alignment and hesitation, and I could see now how carefully everything had been balanced before, how much of it depended on my silence being interpreted as compliance rather than intention. And I realized that the most powerful thing I had done was not reacting, not confronting, but simply remaining unchanged on the surface, because it forced them to question what they could not see, and that question would grow, slowly, quietly, until it disrupted their sense of control. And at one point Lily stood and walked toward the kitchen, offering to bring out dessert, and I followed a moment later, not urgently, not suspiciously, but naturally, as if it were part of the routine. And when we stood side by side at the counter she glanced at me again, that same searching look in her eyes, and I met it this time, not with confrontation, but with calm recognition, just long enough for her to register that something was different, not in what I said, because I said nothing, but in what I did not say, and I turned away to reach for the plates, continuing the task as if nothing had passed between us. And that moment, brief as it was, shifted something I could feel even without seeing it fully, because uncertainty had now moved from me to her. And when we returned to the living room the conversation resumed, but it no longer felt entirely steady. There was a slight imbalance now, a subtle change in tone that only someone paying close attention would notice, and I sat there quietly, listening, observing, allowing that shift to deepen without interference. Because this was no longer about proving anything, it was about allowing them to realize, slowly and without explanation, that the situation they believed they controlled was no longer as certain as it once seemed. And as the evening came to an end and they prepared to leave, I walked them to the door with the same composed warmth, the same steady presence. And when the door closed behind them, I did not feel relief or anger, only clarity, because everything was now moving exactly as it needed to. Not through force, not through confrontation, but through something far more effective, the quiet unraveling of an assumption they had built everything on, the belief that I would remain predictable, and that belief was already beginning to fail. The following days unfolded with a quiet precision that no one else seemed to notice, but every small detail now carried meaning for me. Every glance, every pause, every carefully chosen word becoming part of a pattern I was no longer ignoring but actively reading. And I could see the shift continuing to take hold, subtle at first, then increasingly difficult to hide, because uncertainty, once introduced, does not remain contained. It spreads, it settles into the spaces where confidence once lived, and I saw it most clearly in Lily, not in anything she said, because her words remained just as composed as before, but in the way she watched me now, the slight hesitation before she spoke, the way her eyes lingered a fraction longer, as if searching for something she could not quite define. And that told me that the balance had changed, that she was no longer entirely certain of her position, and that mattered more than anything she could have said out loud. And Robert, too, had begun to show small signs. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would draw attention in a room full of people, but enough for someone paying attention, enough to reveal that whatever quiet understanding had existed between them was no longer as stable as it had been. And I continued exactly as I had planned, moving through each day with the same calm consistency, maintaining the structure they expected while quietly reinforcing the one they did not. And when the time came for my next appointment, I did not announce it. I did not hint at it. I simply went, handling what needed to be handled with the same measured approach, making adjustments where necessary, securing what had always been mine but had been left unguarded for too long. And I did it all without urgency, without visible change, because the strength of it came from its invisibility. And when I returned home that afternoon, I stood for a moment in the entryway, looking around the house that had held my life for so many years, and I realized that for the first time I was not looking at it through the lens of memory or expectation. I was seeing it clearly, as it was, as a space that had been shaped by me, maintained by me, and now, quietly, protected by me in ways that no one else had anticipated. And that clarity stayed with me as the evening approached, as the familiar rhythm of another day settled into place. And when Robert spoke to me that night, asking if everything was all right, his tone casual, but his eyes searching, I met his gaze calmly and told him that everything was exactly as it should be. And that was the truth, just not in the way he understood it. And I could see the moment linger, the way he seemed to consider asking something more, something direct, but chose not to. And that hesitation told me everything I needed to know, that whatever confidence he once had was beginning to fracture, not because I had confronted him, not because I had revealed anything, but because I had removed the one element they had relied on, my predictability, and without that, they were left to question everything on their own. And that questioning would do far more than any accusation ever could. And as I moved through the house that night, turning off lights, closing doors, maintaining the quiet order I had always kept, I felt no need to rush, no need to force anything forward, because everything was already in motion, every piece already shifting into place, and I understood now that control does not come from reacting to what others do. It comes from deciding what you will do regardless of them. And for the first time since that evening at the table, I allowed myself a small, private acknowledgement of what had truly changed. Not them, not the situation, but me. The way I saw it, the way I moved within it, the way I no longer waited for things to happen to me, but chose how